On Christmas Day, my son looked me in the eye, turned the lock on his front door, and said, "You are no longer family." In that frozen moment, I realized the greatest betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the ones you once called your own. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. Christmas morning dawned with a brittle cold that seemed to seep through the walls of my old house, settling into the bones of the place and the man who lived there. I woke before the sun, as I always did, out of habit more than necessity, and sat for a long time at the edge of my bed, staring at the faded photograph of my late wife, Eleanor, perched on the nightstand. Her smile, forever frozen in that moment from a Christmas long ago, seemed to mock the silence that now filled the house. I made coffee, the way she used to, strong and black, and stood at the kitchen window watching the world outside turn pale with the first light. The street was quiet, dusted with a thin layer of snow, the kind that made everything look softer, gentler, as if the world itself was trying to offer a small mercy. I thought about the years when this house had been full, of laughter, of music, of the chaos that comes with children and dogs, and too many relatives crammed around a table too small for their ambitions. Those days felt impossibly distant now, like a story I'd once heard, but could no longer remember the details of. My son David had called 2 weeks ago, his voice clipped and formal, to invite me to Christmas dinner at his new house across town. It was the first invitation I'd received since Eleanor's funeral, and I'd accepted without hesitation, desperate for any scrap of connection, any chance to feel like I still belonged somewhere. I spent the next days in a flurry of preparation, buying a new shirt, wrapping gifts for my grandchildren, even baking Eleanor's famous pecan pie from her handwritten recipe, the paper smudged with years of use and love. I arrived at David's house just before noon, the pie balanced carefully on the passenger seat, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. The neighborhood was one of those new developments, all identical houses and manicured lawns, a world away from the old brick streets where David had grown up. I parked at the curb, took a deep breath, and walked up the path, rehearsing the words I would say, the smile I would wear. The door was closed, but I could hear voices inside, David's, his wife Laura's, the high-pitched laughter of my grandchildren. I rang the bell, shifting from foot to foot as the cold bit through my coat. The voices inside fell silent, replaced by the muffled sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened a crack, and David's face appeared, his expression unreadable. "Dad," he said, not moving to let me in. "You're early." I smiled, holding up the pie like a peace offering. Traffic was light. I thought I'd help with the cooking. He didn't smile back. Instead, he stepped outside, pulling the door shut behind him, and stood between me and the warmth of his home. "Listen, Dad," he said, his voice low. "There's been a change of plans." I felt the first flicker of unease, but forced myself to keep smiling. "What kind of change?" He looked away, his jaw tight. "Laura's parents decided to come after all. It's complicated." He didn't answer. Instead, he reached behind him and pulled the door shut, the lock clicking into place with a finality that echoed in my chest. I stood there for a long moment, the cold seeping through my coat, the pie trembling in my hands. I could hear the muffled sound of laughter from inside, the clatter of dishes, the life I was no longer a part of. I turned and walked back to my car, my legs numb, my heart heavier than it had ever been. I sat behind the wheel, staring at the house, at the wreath on the door, at the lights twinkling in the windows. I thought about driving away, about leaving and never looking back, but something inside me refused to move. I had spent my whole life giving, my time, my money, my love, always believing that family was a bond that could not be broken. But as I sat there, watching my son celebrate Christmas without me, I realized that bond had been severed, not by time or distance, but by choice. I started the car, the engine rumbling to life, and drove away, the pie still untouched on the seat beside me. I didn't know where I was going, only that I couldn't go home, not yet, not with the weight of that locked door pressing down on me. I drove aimlessly through the city, past the old neighborhood, past the park where David had played as a boy, past the church where Eleanor and I had been married. Everywhere I looked, I saw ghosts, of laughter, of love, of a life that no longer belonged to me. As the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of gold and crimson, I made a decision. I would not let this be the end of my story. I would not let David's rejection define the rest of my life. I would find a way to reclaim my dignity, to remind him and myself of the man I had been, the father I still was. Christmas, I decided, was not just a day on the calendar. It was a test, and I would not fail it. Not this year, not ever. I drove for hours, the city blurring past my windows as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The humiliation burning in my chest like a brand. Every memory of Christmases past, David's small hands tearing open presents, Eleanor's laughter echoing through the house, the warmth of belonging, felt like a cruel joke now, a story I'd told myself to justify years of sacrifice. I pulled into a deserted parking lot behind an old diner, the kind of place where time seemed to stand still, and sat in the silence, the pie cooling on the seat beside me. I thought about calling my sister, about finding some comfort in her familiar voice. But the shame was too raw, too fresh. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror, searching for the man I used to be, the man who had built a life from nothing, who had survived loss and disappointment, who had never let anyone make him feel small. I remembered the years after Eleanor died, how I'd poured everything I had into David and his family, paying off their debts, helping with the down payment on their house, babysitting the kids whenever they needed a break. I'd told myself it was what fathers did, that love was measured in sacrifice, that someday it would all come back to me in the form of gratitude, respect, a place at the table. But as I sat there, watching the world go on without me, I realized I'd been wrong. Love, I decided, was not a transaction, it was a choice. And David had made his. He had chosen to lock me out, to erase me from his life, to treat me as an inconvenience rather than a father. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for years finally boiled over, sharp and clear. I would not beg for scraps of affection. I would not let him rewrite the story of our family to suit his own comfort. If he wanted to erase me, I would show him what it meant to lose everything I had given. I started the car and drove home, my mind racing with plans, with memories, with a cold determination I hadn't felt in years. The house was dark when I arrived, the silence pressing in on me like a physical weight. I set the pie on the counter, poured myself a glass of whiskey, and sat at the kitchen table, pulling out the old ledger where I kept track of every loan, every gift, every sacrifice I'd made for David and his family. The numbers were staggering. Mortgage payments, car repairs, tuition for the grandchildren's private school, even the down payment on the very house where I'd just been turned away. I flipped through the pages, each entry a reminder of the years I'd spent putting their needs before my own, of the dreams I'd deferred, the comforts I'd denied myself. I thought about the trust fund Eleanor and I had set up for the grandchildren, the life insurance policy that named David as the sole beneficiary, the deed to the lake house that still sat in my name, waiting for the day when David would be ready to take it over. I realized, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I held the keys to everything David valued. his security, his comfort, his future. And for the first time, I wondered what would happen if I took it all away. The thought was intoxicating, a rush of power that made my hands tremble. I spent the rest of the night at the kitchen table, making lists, gathering documents, planning my next move. By morning, I had a plan, a way to remind David of everything he owed, of the cost of his betrayal. I would not confront him with anger or accusations. I would not beg for forgiveness or plead for a place in his life. Instead, I would take back everything I had given, piece by piece, until he understood what it meant to be truly alone. I started with the trust fund, calling the bank to freeze the account until further notice, citing concerns about misuse of funds. The manager, an old friend from my days at the factory, didn't ask questions. "You do what you need to do, Frank," he said, his voice low and steady. "Family's complicated." Next, I called the insurance company, changing the beneficiary on my policy to my niece, a single mother who had always treated me with kindness and respect. I drafted a new will, leaving the lake house to my sister's children, the only ones who had ever bothered to visit me after Eleanor died. Each call, each signature felt like a small act of liberation, a way to reclaim the years I had lost to David's ingratitude. By noon, I had undone decades of sacrifice, erasing David from every document, every account, every future plan. I felt lighter than I had in years, the weight of obligation finally lifting from my shoulders. I made one final call to the lawyer who had handled Eleanor's estate and asked him to draft a letter to David, informing him of the changes. "Make it formal," I said, my voice steady. "No explanations, just the facts." He agreed, promising to send the letter by certified mail the next day. I hung up the phone and sat in the quiet, the house suddenly feeling less empty, less haunted by the ghosts of Christmases past. I poured another glass of whiskey and raised it to Eleanor's photograph, her smile now a promise rather than a memory. "Merry Christmas, my love," I whispered. "This year, I'm giving myself the gift of freedom." As the sun set on Christmas Day, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. I had lost a son, but I had found myself, and in the end, that was the only family I needed. The days that followed were strangely quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I moved through my routines with a new sense of purpose, no longer weighed down by the constant anxiety of waiting for David's call, or the guilt that had shadowed every decision since Eleanor's death. I spent my mornings walking the neighborhood, nodding to old friends who waved from their porches, their faces lined with the same years and losses that marked my own. I stopped at the bakery on Main Street, buying a loaf of fresh bread and chatting with Mrs. Callahan, who had known me since I was a boy. She asked about David, about the grandchildren, and I smiled, telling her they were well, that everyone was busy with the holidays. I didn't mention the locked door, the cold rejection, the way my world had shifted in a single afternoon. Some wounds, I decided, were best kept private. In the afternoons, I sorted through the boxes in the attic, the detritus of a life spent building and giving and hoping. I found old letters from Eleanor, yellowed with age but still fragrant with her perfume, and read them by the window as the winter light faded. I found David's childhood drawings, his first report card, the baseball glove he'd begged for one summer and then forgotten by fall. Each artifact was a reminder of the years I'd spent loving him, of the father I had tried so hard to be. But as I packed them away, I felt no bitterness, only a quiet resolve. I would not let his choices define me. I would not let his absence become the story of my life. On the third day after Christmas, the phone rang. I recognized the number immediately. David's cell, the one I had programmed into my phone years ago, back when I still believed that love could be measured in proximity. I let it ring twice before answering, my voice calm, almost detached. "Hello, David?" There was a pause, the sound of children laughing in the background, and then his voice, strained and uncertain. "Dad, I got a letter from the lawyer. What's going on?" I took a deep breath, steadying myself. I made some changes. To the trust, the insurance, the will. I thought it was time. He was silent for a moment, the weight of my words settling between us. "You didn't even talk to me about it," he said finally, his voice rising. "You just cut me out?" I closed my eyes, picturing his face, the way he had looked at me on Christmas morning, as if I were a stranger at his door. "You made your choice, David. You locked me out. Ma's just following your lead," he sputtered, searching for words. "That's not fair. You know how complicated things are with Laura's family, with the kids." It wasn't personal. I almost laughed at that, the absurdity of it. "It felt personal, David. It felt like you were telling me I didn't matter, that I was no longer family." He was quiet again, the silence stretching out until I wondered if he had hung up. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. The kids were asking about you. They missed you at dinner." I felt a pang of longing, but pushed it aside. I missed them too. But I can't keep giving and giving, only to be shut out when it's inconvenient. I have to look out for myself now. He sighed, the sound heavy with regret. "Is there any way we can fix this?" I thought about it, about the years I had spent waiting for him to see me, to appreciate me, to treat me as more than a wallet or a babysitter. "That's up to you, David. If you want to be family, you have to act like it. You have to show up, not just when it's easy, but when it matters." He promised to call again, to visit, to make things right. But I heard the uncertainty in his voice, the fear that maybe, this time, I wouldn't be waiting. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet, the house filled with the soft ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I felt no anger, only a deep, abiding sense of peace. For the first time in years, I was living on my own terms, no longer defined by someone else's expectations or disappointments. I spent the evening writing letters to old friends, reconnecting with people I had lost touch with in the chaos of raising a family. I made plans to visit my sister in the spring, to take a trip to the coast, to see the world beyond the narrow confines of obligation. I realized with a kind of wonder that I was free, not just from David's ingratitude, but from the story I had been in telling myself for so long. I was not a victim. I was not a martyr. I was a man who had loved deeply, who had given everything, and who had finally learned to love himself enough to walk away. That night, as I lay in bed, I listened to the wind rattling the windows, the sound no longer lonely but full of promise. I knew there would be hard days ahead, moments when the ache of loss would return, when the memory of that locked door would sting. But I also knew that I had survived worse, that I was stronger than I had ever realized. And as I drifted off to sleep, I whispered a silent prayer, not for David, not for reconciliation, but for the courage to keep moving forward, to keep choosing myself, one day at a time. The new year arrived with little fanfare. The world outside my window blanketed in snow, the streets quiet except for the occasional scrape of a shovel or the distant laughter of children bundled in bright scarves. I found myself settling into a rhythm, the days marked by small rituals, coffee in the morning, a walk through the park, afternoons spent reading or tending to the repairs I'd neglected for years. Without the constant demands of David's emergencies, I discovered a kind of peace I hadn't known since Eleanor was alive. I fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, repainted the front porch, even started volunteering at the local food pantry, where my hands found purpose in the simple work of serving others. The people there didn't know my story, didn't care about the drama of my family, and I found comfort in their easy acceptance, their gratitude for a warm meal or a kind word. It was there among strangers that I began to remember who I was before I became someone's father, someone's husband, someone's last resort. I was Frank Miller, a man who had built a life from nothing, who had survived heartbreak and disappointment, who still had something to offer the world. The days grew longer, the light returning slowly, and with it a sense of possibility. I started making plans, small at first, then bolder as my confidence grew. I booked a trip to the coast, something Eleanor and I had always dreamed of but never managed to do. I called my sister and arranged to visit her in the spring, promising to bring the old family photo albums and a bottle of her favorite wine. I even joined a book club at the library, where I found myself laughing with people who had no idea about the locked door, the Christmas that had changed everything. It was in these moments, surrounded by new friends and old memories, that I realized how much I had lost by clinging to a version of family that no longer existed. I had spent years trying to earn a place at David's table, believing that love was something to be bargained for, that loyalty could be bought with sacrifice. But as I watched the waves crash against the shore on a cold February morning, I understood that family was not defined by blood or obligation, but by the people who showed up, who cared, who made space for you in their lives. I sent postcards to my grandchildren, telling them about the ocean, the seals I'd seen basking on the rocks, the taste of salt in the air. I didn't know if David would let them read my words, but I hoped that someday they would find them, and know that their grandfather had lived, had loved, had found joy even in the aftermath of loss. The weeks passed, and with them the sharp edges of my anger softened, replaced by a quiet resolve. I would not let bitterness define me. I would not let David's choices become the measure of my worth. I had given him everything I could, and now I was giving myself permission to move on. One afternoon in early March, as I was returning from the food pantry, I found an envelope in my mailbox, addressed in David's handwriting. My heart pounded as I carried it inside, the old ache flaring up, despite my best efforts to let go. I sat at the kitchen table, turning the envelope over in my hands, debating whether to open it or throw it away. In the end, curiosity won out. The letter was short, almost businesslike. David wrote that he understood my decision, that he was sorry for the way things had turned out, that he hoped we could find a way to rebuild, for the sake of the grandchildren, if nothing else. He didn't mention the locked door, didn't apologize for the pain he had caused, but there was a note of uncertainty in his words, a hint that maybe, just maybe, he was beginning to understand the cost of his actions. I read the letter twice, then set it aside, unsure of how to respond. I wanted to believe that people could change, that wounds could heal, but I also knew that forgiveness was not the same as forgetting. I would not rush back into the old patterns, would not offer myself up for more disappointment. If David wanted to rebuild, he would have to do the work, to show up, to prove that he valued me not for what I could give, but for who I was. That night I wrote him a reply, short, honest, without bitterness. I told him about my trip, about the new friends I had made, about the peace I had found in letting go. I told him that I loved him, that I always would, but that I could not go back to the way things were. If he wanted a relationship, it would have to be built on respect, on honesty, on mutual effort. I sealed the letter and dropped it in the mailbox the next morning, feeling a sense of closure I hadn't expected. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, I was not afraid. I was free. Spring arrived in fits and starts, the world outside my window slowly shaking off the last traces of winter. I found myself looking forward to each new day, to the small surprises that came with the changing season, the first crocus pushing through the thawing earth, the sound of children's laughter drifting through open windows, the return of birdsong at dawn. My life, once so tightly bound to David's needs and moods, had expanded in ways I hadn't imagined possible. I spent my mornings at the food pantry, my afternoons reading in the park, or tending to the small garden I'd started behind the house. I learned the names of my neighbors, shared coffee and stories with the widower next door, even joined a group that met once a week to play cards at the community center. These new connections, fragile at first, grew stronger with each passing week, weaving a safety net beneath me that I hadn't known I needed. I was no longer just someone's father, someone's burden, someone waiting for a call that never came. I was Frank, a man with a life of his own, a man who had survived heartbreak and found meaning on the other side. It was during one of these card games that I met Evelyn, a retired schoolteacher with a quick wit and a gentle smile. We struck up a friendship, sharing stories of our children, our losses, our hopes for the future. She listened without judgment when I told her about Christmas, about the locked door, about the years I had spent trying to earn a place in a family that no longer wanted me. She squeezed my hand and told me that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is walk away from what hurts them, to choose themselves even when it feels like giving up. Her words stayed with me, echoing in the quiet moments when doubt crept in. I realized that I had spent so much of my life trying to be indispensable to others that I had forgotten how to be important to myself. With Evelyn's encouragement, I began to dream again, not just of surviving, but of thriving, of building a life that was rich and full, even if it looked nothing like the one I had planned. I started taking day trips to nearby towns, exploring museums and art galleries, eating in small cafes where no one knew my name. I sent postcards to my grandchildren from every stop, telling them about the things I had seen, the people I had met, the lessons I was learning. I didn't know if David would let them read my words, but I hoped that someday they would understand that their grandfather had chosen to live, not just exist. As the weeks passed, I heard from David only sporadically, an occasional text, a brief phone call, always polite but distant, as if he were testing the waters, unsure of how to bridge the gap between us. I responded with kindness, but kept my boundaries firm, refusing to be drawn back into the old patterns of giving without receiving. I wanted him to know that I was open to reconciliation, but only on terms that honored my worth, my dignity, my right to be treated with respect. One afternoon in late April, as I was planting tomatoes in the garden, I heard a car pull into the driveway. I wiped my hands on my jeans and walked around to the front of the house, my heart pounding with a mixture of hope and apprehension. David stood by his car, looking older than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his eyes shadowed with regret. He held a small box in his hands, wrapped in plain brown paper. "Hi, Dad," he said, his voice uncertain. "I brought something for you." I nodded, waiting. He handed me the box, his hands trembling. "It's just some old photos. I found them when we were cleaning out the garage. I thought you might want them." I took the box, feeling the weight of years between us. "Thank you," I said quietly. He looked at me, his eyes searching. "I'm sorry, Dad. For Christmas. For everything. I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." I studied his face, searching for sincerity, for the son I had loved and lost and still hoped to find. Trying is a good start, I said, but it's going to take time. Trust doesn't come back overnight. He nodded, tears shining in his eyes. I know, I miss you. The kids miss you. I felt a surge of longing, but kept my voice steady. I miss them too. Maybe we can start with a visit, something small, no expectations. He smiled, a real smile this time, and for the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. As he drove out, I carried the box inside, setting it on the kitchen table. I opened it slowly, sifting through the photographs, birthdays, vacations, Christmases long past. Each image was a reminder of what we had shared, of the love that had once bound us together. I knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that there would be setbacks and disappointments, but I also knew that I was no longer afraid. I had survived the worst and come out stronger on the other side. I was ready to begin again, on my own terms, with my head held high. The days after David's visit felt different, as if a window had been opened in a room that had grown stale with old air. I found myself thinking about him and the grandchildren more often, but the thoughts no longer carried the sting of rejection. Instead, there was a cautious optimism, a sense that perhaps the story of our family was not finished, only paused, waiting for a new chapter to begin. I spent more time with Evelyn, our friendship deepening into something warmer, more intimate. We shared dinners at her house, long walks by the river, evenings spent listening to old records and talking about the lives we had lived before fate had brought us together. She told me about her own struggles with her children, the disappointments and misunderstandings that had shaped her journey. We laughed about the stubbornness of grown children, the way they seemed to forget that their parents were people with dreams and limits of their own. With Evelyn, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years, not as a father or a provider, but as a man with his own story, his own worth. One Saturday in May, she invited me to join her at a community picnic in the park. I hesitated at first, worried about running into people who might ask about David, about the family I no longer saw at church or neighborhood gatherings. But Evelyn squeezed my hand and told me that sometimes the only way to heal was to step back into the world, to let people see you living, not just surviving. The picnic was a blur of laughter and music, children chasing each other across the grass, neighbors sharing stories, and food beneath the shade of old oaks. I found myself relaxing, letting go of the old anxieties, the fear of judgment. People greeted me warmly, asked about my garden, complimented the pie I'd brought. Eleanor's recipe, still the best in town. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I belonged, not because of what I could give, but because of who I was. As the sun set and the crowd began to thin, I sat with Evelyn on a bench overlooking the river, watching the water catch the last light of day. She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "You're allowed to be happy, Frank. You don't have to earn it." Her words settled over me like a blessing, and I realized how much I had needed to hear them. That night, as I walked home beneath a sky full of stars, I thought about the journey I had taken since Christmas. The pain of that locked door, the anger and grief, the slow, steady work of rebuilding a life from the ashes of disappointment. I understood now that revenge was not about hurting those who had hurt me, but about reclaiming my own power, my own joy. I had drawn my boundaries, demanded respect, and in doing so had found a peace that no one could take from me. The next morning, I received a call from David. His voice was softer, more hesitant than before. "Dad, the kids have a school play next week. They'd really like you to come." I hesitated, memories of past rejections flickering through my mind, but Evelyn's words echoed in my heart. "I'd like that," I said. Just let me know the time. The day of the play, I dressed in my best shirt, the one Eleanor had always said brought out the blue in my eyes, and drove across town to the school auditorium. I arrived early, finding a seat near the front, my heart pounding with nerves and hope, when the children spotted me in the crowd, their faces lit up, and I felt a surge of love so fierce it brought tears to my eyes. After the performance, they ran to me, hugging me tightly, chattering about their roles and the excitement of being on stage. David stood nearby, watching, his expression a mixture of relief and gratitude. "Thank you for coming, Dad," he said quietly. "It means a lot to them. To me." I nodded, feeling the old wounds begin to heal, not with grand gestures or apologies, but with small acts of presence, of showing up when it mattered. As I drove home that night, the city lights twinkling in the distance, I realized that I had finally found my place. Not at the head of David's table, but at the center of my own life, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was, not just for what I could give. The locked door of Christmas past was just that, past. I had walked through it, into a future I had built with my own hands, my own heart. And for the first time in years, I was truly deeply content. Summer arrived in a rush of green, the world outside bursting with life and color. My days settled into a gentle rhythm, mornings in the garden, afternoons spent with Evelyn or volunteering, evenings filled with books, music, and the quiet satisfaction of a life reclaimed. The pain of that Christmas was no longer a raw wound, but a scar, a reminder of what I had survived, and of the strength I had found in choosing myself. David and I spoke more often now, our conversations cautious but honest, each of us learning to navigate the new boundaries I had drawn. He no longer called only when he needed something, and I no longer rushed to solve his problems. Instead, we talked about the children, about his work, about memories of Eleanor that made us both laugh and sometimes fall silent with longing. There were still moments of awkwardness, of things left unsaid, but I no longer felt the old desperation to fix everything, to make him love me the way I had always hoped. I understood now that love could not be forced, that respect could not be bought with sacrifice. It had to be earned, and it had to be mutual. One afternoon in July, David invited me to a barbecue at his house. I hesitated, the memory of that locked door still vivid, but Evelyn encouraged me to go, to see for myself how much had changed. I arrived with a plate of deviled eggs, another of Eleanor's recipes, and was greeted at the door by my grandchildren, their faces bright with excitement. Laura, David's wife, offered a polite smile, her eyes wary but not unkind. The house was filled with laughter and the smell of grilled meat, the backyard alive with children's games and the easy chatter of neighbors. For a moment, I stood at the edge of it all, uncertain, but then David appeared at my side, his hand resting lightly on my shoulder. "I'm glad you came, Dad," he said, his voice sincere. "It wouldn't be the same without you." I nodded, feeling a wave of emotion rise in my chest. We sat together beneath the shade of an old maple tree, watching the children play, talking about nothing and everything. There was no mention of the past, no apologies or explanations, just the simple comfort of being together, of sharing a moment that felt, if not perfect, at least real. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, David walked me to my car. He hesitated, then said, "I know I can't change what happened, but I want to do better, for you, for the kids." I looked at him, seeing not just my son, but a man trying to make amends, to build something new from the ruins of our old life. "We both do," I said quietly. "It's never too late to start again." That night, as I sat on my porch with Evelyn, watching the fireflies dance in the warm summer air, I felt a sense of peace I had never known. I had lost so much, but I had gained something far more valuable. A sense of self, a life that was truly my own. I thought about the journey I had taken, the pain and the anger, the slow, steady work of healing. I realized that revenge was not about punishing those who had hurt me, but about refusing to let their actions define my future. I had chosen to live, to love, to forgive, not for David's sake, but for my own. As the stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, I whispered a silent thank you to Eleanor, to Evelyn, to the friends and strangers who had helped me find my way. I knew there would still be hard days, moments when the old wounds ached, but I also knew that I was no longer alone. I had built a new family, one chosen not by blood, but by kindness, by respect, by the simple act of showing up. And as I closed my eyes, listening to the sounds of summer all around me, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Autumn crept in quietly, the days growing shorter, the air tinged with the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke. I found myself reflecting more often, not with regret, but with a kind of gentle gratitude for the journey I had taken since that fateful Christmas. The pain of being locked out, of hearing my own son say I was no longer family, had once threatened to break me. Now it felt like a distant echo, a lesson learned at great cost, but with even greater reward. My life was full in ways I had never expected. Evelyn and I spent our weekends exploring small towns, attending local fairs, and savoring the simple pleasures of good company and shared laughter. My garden flourished, the tomatoes and beans thriving under my careful attention, and I took pride in sharing the harvest with neighbors and friends. The food pantry became a second home, a place where I was valued not for my past or my family name, but for the kindness I offered and the work I did. The friendships I had formed there deepened, each one a thread in the tapestry of my new life. David and I continued to rebuild, slowly and carefully, each interaction a step towards something more honest and enduring. He invited me to more family gatherings, sometimes just for coffee, sometimes for a Sunday meal. The grandchildren grew bolder in their affection, no longer shy or uncertain, but eager to share their stories, their triumphs, their small heartbreaks. Laura remained reserved, but I sensed a shift in her as well, a softening, a willingness to let the past be the past. There were still moments of awkwardness, of words left unsaid, but I no longer felt the need to fill every silence, to fix every problem. I had learned that some wounds heal only with time, and that forgiveness, real forgiveness, is a gift we give ourselves as much as others. One crisp October afternoon, David stopped by unannounced, carrying a box of old tools he had found in his garage. "Thought you might want these," he said, setting the box on my porch. We sat together, sipping coffee, watching the leaves swirl in the wind. After a long silence, he spoke. "I've been thinking a lot about that day, about what I said. I wish I could take it back." I looked at him, seeing the vulnerability in his eyes, the weight he still carried. "We can't change the past, David, but we can decide what comes next." He nodded, his shoulders relaxing. "I want you to know I'm grateful for everything, even the things I didn't understand at the time." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "That's all I ever wanted, son, just to be seen, to be valued." We sat in companionable silence, the distance between us shrinking with each passing moment. As the holidays approached, I felt a sense of anticipation, not dread. I decorated the house with Evelyn, stringing lights along the porch, hanging a wreath on the door. I baked Eleanor's pecan pie, the recipe now a bridge between past and present, loss and renewal. On Christmas morning, David and his family arrived early, their arms full of gifts, their faces bright with hope. There was no grand apology, no dramatic reconciliation, just the quiet, steady work of being together, of choosing each other day after day. We gathered around the table, sharing stories, laughter, and the simple joy of belonging. As I looked around at the faces of those I loved, I realized that the greatest revenge was not in taking back what I had given, but in refusing to let bitterness define me. I had built a life of meaning, of connection, of self-respect. I had shown David and myself that family is not a right but a privilege, one that must be earned and cherished. That night, after everyone had gone, I stood on the porch. The cold air sharp and clean, the sky ablaze with stars. I thought of Eleanor, of the years we had shared, of the lessons I had learned in her absence. I whispered a thank you to the universe, to the people who had helped me find my way, to the man I had become. I was no longer waiting for someone to unlock the door, to invite me in. I had found my own way home, and in that quiet, starlit moment, I knew that I was, at last, truly free. Winter's chill lingered, but inside my heart there was only warmth. The lessons of the past year had settled into me like the hush of new snow, quiet, steady, undeniable. I no longer measured my worth by invitations or by the approval of those who once took me for granted. I had learned to honor my own boundaries, to give without losing myself, to forgive without forgetting. The world outside my window was the same, but I was not. I had become a man who could stand alone, not out of bitterness, but out of hard-won peace. As the new year approached, I found myself reflecting on the journey that had brought me here. I thought of the locked door, the words that had once shattered me, and realized they no longer held power over my days. I had built a life that was mine, rich with friendship, with love, with the simple joys of honest work and quiet evenings. Evelyn and I planned a small celebration, just the two of us, to welcome the year ahead. We toasted to new beginnings, to the courage it takes to start over, to the wisdom that comes from letting go. David called on New Year's Day, his voice steady, his words sincere. Dad, thank you for not giving up on us. Thank you for teaching me what it means to be family. I smiled, feeling the last pieces of old pain fall away. We're all learning, son. That's what matters. The grandchildren spoke to me on the phone, their laughter bright, their love uncomplicated. I knew then that the legacy I would leave was not one of sacrifice and silence, but of resilience, of hope, of a life reclaimed. On the first Sunday of the year, I stood at my front door, looking out at the world with new eyes. The past was a story I had survived, but the future was a story I would write for myself. I stepped outside, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the strength in my bones, the lightness in my step. I was not defined by the doors that had closed behind me, but by the ones I had opened for myself. And as I walked down the path, toward whatever waited beyond the horizon, I carried with me the quiet certainty that I was, at last, exactly where I belonged.